Hey everybody, it's Akbar and Adam here on a pleasant Friday morning. Hope you're all doing well. This is part of our lecture series here for Modern Philosophy, Spring 21 at UNT. Today's topic will be the unnatural growth of the natural. We're going to continue on this idea of carbon dioxide removal, CDR. And I'll talk a bit about the directions we're taking today in that, and I will try to keep myself shorter than last time. We'll see how that goes. I just get so excited about this stuff, and Akbar sometimes doesn't work the computer very well, but here we go. All right. Today's objective is to give you a theoretical lens through which to see both modern philosophy and carbon dioxide removal as a topic in modernity or modern philosophy. I'll start with a quick review, and then I'll say that I think we're at a fork in the road in terms of where we go with these lectures. I'm going to go with some more theory for this lecture and the next one, and then we'll get into more details about CDR. I just feel like it's important to give you some wider lenses through which to think about the meaning of all of this stuff that we're talking about and to relate it to modern philosophy that we're studying in class. So I'll have these concepts, the Anthropocene, capital scene, the Modernocene I just made up. And today we're going to look at Hannah Arendt. You know that I'm a big fan of hers. I think she was the smartest political theorist in the 20th century. And I think if we can walk away knowing what she meant by a laboring society and unnatural growth of the natural, that would be good. So I'll try to get to that point pretty quickly and then kind of dilate a little bit on Arendt, but not too much. And then we'll end by just tying this back to the real world, to stuff happening right now with President Joe Biden's climate plan and how it's all about jobs and investment and economic growth. In other words, it's a climate plan for a laboring society, which is one way to theorize modern society. Okay. Review. We looked at this slide last time. We talked about the basics of climate change, the greenhouse effect, global warming, CO2 emissions are driving this. We talked about how there's roughly 40 gigatons of CO2 emitted annually, about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent when you take into account methane emissions, other greenhouse gases, and land use changes. And we saw how quickly this has developed and how it's so unevenly distributed. Africa, for example, a tiny slice of this. The United States, a much bigger slice, certainly disproportionate to its size. China growing now. We also, I think this is my other slide for review, and then we'll get to new stuff. Just to remind, or I think I have one more after this, to remind you there's really three main approaches to climate change. There's mitigation, reducing our emissions. There's geoengineering, carbon dioxide removal, CDR is one of these, which is kind of more or less directly intervening in the climate system, in this case by sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere one way or the other. And then there's adaptation, which is finding ways to be resilient in the face of inevitable climate change, because climate is change. Right? Last slide for review, we talked about those three strategies just in terms of this carbon budget, which is like a bucket of emissions. We have basically used up almost our entire budget if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees C warming since the industrial era began. So there's these three options: adaptation, putting on your boots, getting ready for the overflow. That is, let's get resilient in the face of what's going to be almost inevitably more climate extremes. There's mitigation, turning off the spigot, that is stopping the emissions. GE had a big announcement today. I think it's huge. They are not going to sell any cars with tailpipe emissions, internal combustion engines, after the year 2035. That's amazing. Or you can drill a hole in the bottom of the bucket. Like, that would be carbon dioxide removal. All of these can work hand in hand, and they're all going to have to work hand in hand. So these aren't mutually exclusive. Okay, so that's review. Where I think we are in this class with this case study in modernity and modern philosophy is a fork in the road. Now, we could go down further details about the kinds of CDR out there, the current state of art, who's doing it, the ethical dilemmas posed by this, the socioeconomic conditions shaping all of it, political fights, particularly in the US about this stuff. But before we do that, I think we need more theory. Theory just means a calm and resourceful vision of the world. It just means you're climbing up on the mountaintop and you're trying to look down and get a sense of the rough landscape, roughly that is, right, in general. So its decisive features, its crucial dimensions. How can we get a sense of the big picture here and get oriented? That's what I want to provide this lecture and next time. So let's look at CDR as an instance of something bigger, a larger pattern. And of course, I think it's an instance of modernity. It's an instance of the world that Bacon and Descartes and Locke and Kant have helped to articulate and create. But what does that mean? Okay, and there's lots of ways to theorize modernity. Hannah Arendt is doing that for us, and that's one way to do it, and that's what I want to focus on today. Next time, we'll look at the eco-modernists. They're also theorizing modernity, so they'll give us another lens to look at this case study through, or they'll give us a kind of another view from the mountaintop. Okay, here's a way to look at the big picture. What happened here? Right? So this is amazing. Human population growth. Humans have been on the planet for 200,000 years, roughly. And for the vast majority of that time, our population stayed way below 1 billion. It's only in the last couple hundred years that that just took off like a rocket ship. So when we ask this question about theory, what happened? I want to ask these big questions. Why did this happen here? What's going on? Look at this other one, right? This is 800,000 years of data, so humans haven't been around for this entire time. But you can see, general fluctuations between roughly 200 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere to 300 parts per million. And then whammo, all of a sudden we're up over 400 parts per million. What's going on? How did that happen? Why did it happen? That's the theory questions I want to answer. Now, one term of art nowadays is the Anthropocene, right? So if you know, in geologic time, geologists divide up Earth's history into these eras and epochs. And we're in the Holocene now. That graph I just showed you kind of covers the Holocene. Maybe we're in the Anthropocene, that is anthropos, humans, the age of humans. In other words, hundreds of millions of years from now, some alien civilization visits planet Earth and they dig down to this layer of sediment where we are right now. And they find indications that this was the age of humans. And they say, the Anthropocene. And it would be, in large part, it might be because they see such a spike in the atmospheric CO2 concentration record, right? So maybe we're having these geologic impacts to such an extent that this is the age of humans. And that is one really interesting and powerful, provocative, controversial, theoretical lens to see the big picture, right? And there's a lot going on now in the humanities and the sciences with this term, the Anthropocene. But wait a second. As we know, looking at that graph, not all humans are responsible equally for the state of the planet, for the impacts that we're having. I showed you just one example, Africa and the US. So is it really an Anthropocene? Because that seems to implicate all humans, all of Anthropos. I think that's one really critical lens to put on this concept of the Anthropocene. Right? So maybe it's not doing the work we want it to do. Maybe it's covering over differences. So some people have said it's the Capitalocene. In other words, it's people who live in capitalist systems, and it's the capitalists who are mostly responsible. And I think that is a more precise term. There's a lot going for it. But even Soviet Russia behaved the same way. That is, behaved in a productivist way that was chewing up the earth and causing all of these emissions. Even Marx, if you read Marx, didn't have a problem with production and consumption. He just wanted to switch over the who owns the means of production, right? So he wasn't actually criticizing capitalism in its core productivist function. So maybe there's something else. Maybe it's more than just capitalism. Maybe it's all of expressions of modernity. Maybe it's the Modernocene, and it's the moderns, whoever's caught up in systems of modernity, who are responsible for the impacts on the planet. So in other words, it's not about who owns the means of production, so much as production itself, that there's this productivist and consumerist way of being in the world. Francis Bacon's way of being in the world, controlling nature for the relief of man's estate. or John Locke's notion of convenience as the goal. That's why we're here on Earth, to increase and to create convenience. That's something powerful. This is what Hannah Arendt, I think, would say, that we're actually children of modernity, and what we're witnessing is what she would call the unnatural growth of the natural. That's one way to see this, as the Modernocene. That's what we're in now, the age of modernity. Okay, so I wanted to get to Hannah Arendt, and I almost assigned parts of this book, but I've taught it so often, I said I need to do something different. Plus, it's a 20th century book, 1958, and I wanted to have some fidelity to our time period, roughly 1500 to 1800. But I did want to say Hannah Arendt is a great example, I think the best, of later, subsequent philosophical writing and theorizing about modernity. There's so many examples of this. For example, Hannah Arendt's mentor, Martin Heidegger, also philosophizing in many ways about modernity. Leo Strauss is doing this. And in many ways, of course, almost everybody since 1800 has been thinking about what is this world we've created. And she's a great example of it. She gives us these wonderful categories to think about where we are, and that's very helpful. So the main category she's got is, she says, look, the human condition has two parts. There's the vita contemplativa, the life of the mind, of thinking, and there's the vita activa. In this book, the human condition actually only takes up the latter half, vita activa. But one of the things she says that's, and really this is a book about what happened to the human condition through the wrenching changes of modernity, okay? One of the things that happened is the vita activa has been this long sort of standing push and pull, tug of war with the vita contemplativa in terms of what's most important, what defines us in our true essence, right? In the modern age, the vita activa is most important, right? It's elevated above contemplation. This puts philosophy, by the way, in a weird position, a lower position. Many of the ancient philosophers had argued that really, given that all of our action on planet Earth is futile, look at even the great Roman Empire, everything we do will turn into dust and be forgotten, right? That's a waste of our time. That what we really should be doing is contemplating the eternal. And that's what humans are all about. Well, Arendt says that's not so much what's going on in modernity. We're all about this vita activa. Now, take that vita activa and break it into parts. And she says there's three parts to it. There's labor, there's work, and there's action. Labor is something humans share with all animals. It is the metabolism of our bodies. It's a ceaseless sort of making of the self. Not just the self, but the human species reproducing, right? Work is the activity of reifying, making real and tangible this world around us into which we're born. The cityscape around us, right? The material stuff, our clothing, our jewelry, and, all of this that is the work of our hands to try to make material and real a home on this planet for us, right? So there's labor, which is sort of eating, consuming. There's work, which is building. And then there's action, which can only happen, she says, with humans, because this is the stuff of speech and deeds, and it requires plurality. It requires more than one person. Action is great speech and great deeds. It is our political life together. It's the life of our plurality together, trying to figure out how we should live as a community. Now, here's her answer. Here's her theory of modernity. Modernity is the reversal of this hierarchy. For the pre-moderns, labor was the lowest and it was to be contained. That's why you had slaves, so that you could be freed from labor. Work occupied a kind of middling position, but really the highest form of human expression was action, great speech and great deeds with other people. Life was not all about consuming and laboring. Indeed, you wanted to do that as little as possible so that you could be freed up to appear as a unique individual in the political public sphere where action happens, right? With modernity, she says, that's reversed. Labor has become our highest ideal. Consumption is the other side of the coin with labor. So you do this laboring and it makes you a consuming society. So we have a laboring, consuming society. We're all obsessed with jobs, creating wealth, creating consumables, consuming those things, right? Making that process go faster and faster. That's what our society is all about. Okay? That's modernity, she says. In fact, the word society just is this labor unleashed into a public form, where the pre-moderns wanted to keep it ensconced in the private realm, the realm of the household. Modernity is the unleashing of this labor force. And when you let labor into the public realm changes. We'll talk about that in a second, but labor also changes. So gone is the time of household crafting with the master-apprentice relationship. Now you have labor divided. You should think of Adam Smith as somebody we could have included in this course. The division of labor. You have labor mechanized, machines helping us to do the labor. And you have labor, I want to say, monetized or owned. Think about Karl Marx, great labor theorist, talking about labor power and the surplus labor power that is sort of skimmed off the top by the capitalists. So you have, and then you have people earning a wage, becoming essentially wage slaves, because labor becomes, this labor power becomes a kind of universal human currency that then can be transferred via money, right? So all of this is happening in modernity, she says, and really it's about releasing labor from the private realm, where previously the ideal was to overcome labor and consumption, that was our animal nature, that to be human was to be more than that. Now we say, no, this is our most human quality, is to be laboring and consuming. And this is actually what creates the impersonal mass society that we live in. It's what creates what we call the economy. The economy becomes disembedded from cultural, religious, and familial relationships. It becomes disembedded from a sense of proportion and balance and sufficiency. And it gets unleashed into this growing, limitless process of wealth creation. And that is what she calls the unnatural growth of the natural. Okay, so the title of this little lecture is from her book. Labor is this natural process because all living things do it, right? That is, metabolize, produce, and consume. But it has been unleashed in an unnatural way, she says. So you have this unnatural growth of the natural. So the labor process that is cyclical, and it was kind of chained to this individual wheel in the species wheel of growth and decay. Now it has been unleashed, and it grows on a social level. And as a result, it's consuming not just the earth, right? 70% of the land surface on Earth is shaped by human activities. You talk about the unnatural growth of the natural, or the Anthropocene. It's also consuming the world of work. If you look at even the way we build buildings, if you live in Denton and you watch how quickly houses and buildings go up, it's because even the working world, the material world, is under the impetus of laboring and consuming. And it's accelerating. And labor, even, she says, starts to consume the built world. We throw away our buildings more and more quickly, right? This is an amazing insight. So that's a theoretical lens, I think a really powerful one for thinking about modernity. What is modernity all about? And also thinking about our case study. So let's bring it back to the ground with climate change. If you think about it, climate change politics is all about economic growth and jobs. In fact, that's what all of our politics is about. Hannah Arendt would say, politics is now subservient to the economy. The job of the politician is to manage and grow the economy. Okay, this is John Locke, by the way. Locke said, look, the whole reason we form a civil society, a political sphere, is so that we can protect the wealth holdings of the capitalist class, so that that wealth can trickle down and benefit everybody. This is what we do. So it raises these questions. Do we need degrowth, right? I mean, in other words, is this modern project of this unnatural growth of the natural simply unsustainable, given that we live on a finite planet? But if we have degrowth and we still live under this laboring society, how are people going to make a living, right? Do we need a universal basic income, right? So these are radical questions, I think, raised by climate change that are posing fundamental questions about the modern age. And Hannah Arendt can help us see the stakes of that and clarify what's going on. Do we need to redistribute wealth? Should we have a cap on wealth and income? Okay, these are all, I think, important questions, but what we're witnessing now with the Biden administration is a monumental shift in climate politics. I think it's the beginning of the end of fossil fuels, and it's amazing. And you ask, what's the logic of this? It's not cutting against the grain of modernity. It's going with the grain of modernity. It's all about jobs, growth, and investments. In other words, this is climate politics for a laboring society. This is the way forward, okay? For better or worse, I think if we're going to solve the climate crisis, I think the Biden administration is pitching it just right. This isn't about us sacrificing anything. This is about us creating new jobs for the 21st century and new investment opportunities. Last slide, just to give you some evidence for what I'm saying. If you look at the remarks by President Biden on January 27th, look at the way he pitched it. Creating jobs. Early in his remarks, he said, this is climate day, which means it's jobs day. Okay, this is, in other words, I recognize we live in a laboring society. We need to focus on jobs, good jobs. And that's what he's pitching climate change through this lens. It's fascinating. Finally, some text here. Another big thing you might have missed is Blackrock. I don't understand investment capitalism that well, but Blackrock owns trillions of dollars of investments, and they have so much weight in the world of financial capitalism. And Larry Fink, the head of this investment, megalith, has written a letter just recently talking about the importance of climate change. And look what he says here towards the bottom. It'll move my little thing. We know that climate risk is investment risk, but we also believe that climate transition presents a historic investment opportunity. In other words, the capitalists who control the flow of capital from which jobs are created for a laboring society so that we can continue with consumption, right? And our ideal of a convenient life in mastering and controlling nature. All of this can continue. It's just now we see, instead of climate change being a threat to that, we can see it as a opportunity. Okay, this is an investment opportunity. Okay? And then he says at the end here, he wants all of these companies that they invest in. So they have a lot of power over these companies. This is the letter to the CEOs of these companies. We want you to disclose a plan for how you're going to be net zero in emissions by 2050. So I think our case study on carbon dioxide removal is going to be really timely, because I think we're going to be seeing a lot of companies coming out with fairly detailed plans about how they're going to be net zero. And it'll be interesting to see how many of them employ or rely on or promise some form of carbon dioxide removal as part of those business plans. Maybe it'll happen, maybe not, but I think it's going to be an important thing to watch for. Okay, we're out of time. That was fun. Until next time, may the force be with you.